Just say that we're delighted to welcome back to Google David Peterson, linguist, language creator, and his new book is The Art of Language Invention.
Grab this. All right. By the way, Jeremy, I just want to mention beforehand, you have a great one of those teacher stares. I can wait just as long as you. Yeah. Wonderful. All right. So anyway, thank you all for coming out. I'm delighted to be here again. This is my first time in this room, and I absolutely love the color of the chairs, which of course nobody watching this on YouTube can see, but they're randomly colorful. I would definitely be sitting in an orange chair. Anyway, so so as we're getting started, let me get out of the way my fancy little animation. Check this out. Ooh, sparkly. All right, so that's it's the title of the book. Anyway, so my name is David Peterson, as he mentioned. This is a picture of me. That's my mother buttoning my top button there the morning of my wedding because I couldn't do it. Anyway, so I've created a number of languages for television and film. Some of them you'll know. So for example, for Game of Thrones, I created the Dothraki and Valyrian languages. And this bottom one is Magnuk. That was a language I created for the Giant for last season. I kind of thought that he was going to have more lines than just one. Probably didn't merit an entire language, but hey, now there's a possibility for a great big giant monologue sometime in the future. I'd look forward to it. Anyway, so I've also created languages for Defiance, specifically these languages, and I got the opportunity to create these fancy scripts for them. And I love that I was able to do that. Creating scripts is one of my favorite things to do as a language creator. And you can't always convince the production that it's worthwhile, but sometimes you can. So Defiance, and then I did that for Star-Crossed as well, where I created a language and a writing system. This is a show that was on the CW last year and had a one-season run. After that, I created a language for Thor's The Dark World that was the sequel to Thor. It was called Shivaisith. And I did create a writing system for it, but this was actually, it is a fan-created writing system. So I created it for a fan of the language. It wasn't actually used in the film, but there's basically one real big fan of this language, and I thought, well, all right. Okay, I also created a language for Dominion on Sci-Fi called Lishepus. It's the one that the angels and the 8-balls speak. If you watch that show, I created a language for second season on for the 100. The language that the Grounders speak is called Trigeta slang. And then for Penny Dreadful, which is an amazing show, I created a language for season 2. It's basically the demonic language that you hear Vanessa and the witches speaking periodically, and it's pretty cool. And I'm also happy to announce that I am working on a new show called Emerald City. That's going to be on NBC next year, and all the episodes are directed by Tarsem, which is just crazy. He did The Fall. He's so good. I'm really excited about it. And so the two languages that I created are called Munjatkin and Inha. You can look forward to that. But I am not here today to talk to you about any of those languages at all, any of those fancy languages. I'm here to talk to you about this language, Meg Davey. How many people have heard of this language? Are you serious? Wow. I really did not expect to see any hands. All right, so this is the first language I ever created. I created it as kind of a freshman, sophomore, kind of over the summer type of thing at UC Berkeley. And if you're wondering why the language is called this, I had a girlfriend at the time named Megan. My name is David. And then you've seen like fantasy languages sometimes have names like this: Chesuli, Dothraki, Ferengi, Pakuni, and so that was how you got the name of that embarrassing language. So this is my very first take at it. I had never heard of anybody creating a language for any purpose other than international communication prior to doing this. So I thought, I truly believed I was the first person ever to do it. And in fact, at the time I thought, oh wow, I could create a language for myself, and that maybe me and my girlfriend could speak, and maybe there's actually marketability in this, since nobody's ever thought of this idea before. This is what I believe. This was 2000, bear in mind. It's just that, conlanging was it wasn't very much in the public eye. Anyway, as for how this language worked, I need to take a sidetrack and introduce you to a little bit of Arabic. I'm sure there are some people here who know Arabic, but for those that don't, I took a year of Arabic at UC Berkeley and absolutely fell in love with the language. It's a wonderful language. I never imagined a language that grammatically could work in that way. And one of the unique features of Arabic is that it has something called a root system, usually a triconsonantal root system, where you have something like these three consonants, K, T, and B. And by the way, Arabic is written from right to left, so notice how each consonant matches up with the orthographic form there. And what happens is that this root has something to do with books and writing, all right? But the way that it's reified the way that it is transformed into words of the language is that you actually arrange vowels inside and without these consonants, and also suffixes and prefixes, to form different types of words. And the only thing that remains constant is the linear order of these three consonants. So, for example, these are all verbs in different tenses. At the top we have naktub, which means we write. Then on the lower left we have aktub, which means I write. And then in the past, katabat, which means she wrote. And notice that the only thing that's happening here is K, T, and B are always in the exact same order. Sometimes they're right next to each other. Sometimes there are vowels in between. And you can make even more words. So for example, katib, writer, maktab, office, and kitab, book, just like that. So I thought that was a really, really cool way for a language to work, and I never heard of it before. And so basically, when I was creating my own language, Megdevi, I just copied it wholesale. And I also created this terrible font, which I included just so that you could see how terrible it is. Actually, when you're standing that far back, it actually looks better than it is. But there are just so many little shaky lines and everything, and just god-awful. Anyway, so that you could have like a root like this, jasafa, and have jasif. These are real words from the language. Flamethrower, jisfa, flame-colored, and jasif, flame, like that. So, flamethrower, whatever. And you can also see that with the writing system, I was heavily inspired by Arabic. So if you were to spell something that would be roughly equivalent to the pronunciation of writer in Arabic, katib, it would look like this. And so you can see, like, the K, it's got that thing on it, but it just has like, I don't know, a little bubble on the top. And the B has one dot, except it's above, and there's another little bubble, and the T looks more T-like. It's, It was clearly just kind of derivative. The worst part about it, though, was, in my mind, the way that I understood language to work, and specifically how I created words for this language. So, I mean, grammatically, it was kind of a neat system, but I just want you to look at some of these lexemes. In order to be able to appreciate this, you have to know these three patterns right here. So the 1, 2, and 3 are for the consonants that will change root to root. And then pay attention to the vowels. On top, if it has an a as the first vowel and an I as the second vowel, that's more or less a thing. If it has an A as the first vowel and an I as the second, that's a person. And then if it has E as the first vowel and E as the second vowel, that is a place. All right, so our first word, there wasn't a place one for it, but yalif is sailboat, yalif is sailor. Like, all right, fine, that makes more or less sense. Next, WVD, wived is marina, wavid is mariner. Now, what the difference is between sailor and mariner, I'm not sure there. I mean, we know what the difference is in English. Basically, they came from two different languages, and that's why we have them. But yeah, so now we have both of these words in this language. So I'm like, all right, fine, whatever. And we have danis, which was vessel, specifically an aquatic vessel. So now we have a word for sailboat and vessel, and thenis, which is captain. Next, boat, which is different from sailboat, which is different from vessel. That was chasich. And we also have chisech, boathouse, which is different from marina, and chasich, boater, which is different from sailor, which is different from captain, which is different from mariner. Then it goes even further. We have a very special root that's just for clipper ships, balil. Presumably, balil is somebody who, I don't know, sails a clipper ship or something. But I think that the reason that we even have this word for clipper ship is just because I was a fan of the Clippers. And so, why not? I wonder actually if that BLL root has something to do with the Clippers. All I'm thinking of is Bison Daily. That doesn't probably didn't Somebody remember him? Anybody remember his original name? Because I literally don't. All right, anyway, moving on. Anyway, so yeah, there are a bunch of other crazy things about this language. For example, I had taken Esperanto. So the case system for this language was identical to Esperanto's. Then there the number suffixes, so if you looking at number systems for natural languages is a fascinating thing. But this language literally had separate suffixes for a number of words that were in the tens, hundreds, thousands, hundred thousands, millions, billions, trillions, up to the quadrillions, so that you could take like the root for one and make 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, so on, all the way up to 1 quadrillion. I don't think that there are other languages that do things like that. Here was a special word pattern just for colors, which is weird. I kind of like it. The tenses were identical to Esperanto's. It had this correlative system that was, again, identical to Esperanto's. All of it was purely lifted. And in the beginning, when I just started out, I actually started to translate Shakespeare's The Tempest into this language, and it just keeps going like that, which, I mean, sounds impressive until you know how palely derivative the language is. In fact, it's actually, I get this question a lot about, oh wow, how do you create a full language that's like functional? That's actually not hard. It's not hard to create a language that is completely and fully functional and can do everything you want. It's fairly easy if you're going to copy a lot of things wholesale from other languages and just basically recode them. Then all it takes is the simple matter of just coding it over. It's kind of like if you talk about drawing a human, it's like, wow, it must be tough to draw a human. It's not hard. I mean, there you go. It's a human. I mean, we all recognize it's basically a human. I don't know, he's rubbing his belly while he's pointing, I guess. But of course, what you say is like, oh, what you mean when you say, oh, it's hard to draw a human, you mean it's hard to draw a human that looks realistic. It's easy enough to draw something that's basically a human. Kids get it by the time they're 3 or 4. Same is true of a language. Easy to create a fully functional language. Difficult to create a language that actually looks like a real language that we speak here on Earth. And so for me, the real watershed moment was when I found other language creators online, the early conlang community, the conlang listserv. This is an early photo, and I'm sorry, can't blow up more. It was taken with an old camera. From the first language creation conference in 2006, where a lot of language creators met for the very first time in person. Before that, it was all online interaction. But basically, I found this listserv in late 2000. I joined up, I started reading some messages, people talking about all these different languages. And I was like, what do you mean Tolkien created languages? The Hobbit guy? I didn't know that. Didn't know that Klingon was a language. I didn't know any of that, right? And so at first, of course, which is what naturally happens, when you think you've been doing something really great and you see something vastly different, you think, well, they're just doing it wrong, of course. I'm the one who's really the cool person, and I thought that at the beginning. But as I started to really look at other people's work and study their work and follow all these conversations and see what was going on, that was when I said, oh, I think I understand what I've done here. And this literally 225-page dictionary and reference grammar that I've created for this language, Meg Davy, is total garbage. And so it was then on that it was like, that was my moment zero. I started over and I started learning. And that's basically what I did, what I started in late 2000 and what I've continued to do to even now. And I think one of the most important things that happens, or one of the most important things that happened to me when I keyed in with the community, is I started to ask myself questions that I had never considered before, questions that I'd never imagined before. So I'll give you an example. We have this word corner here in English, and so presuming there's no tricks here, that this box is just an empty box, how many corners have we got here?
8.
There we go, 8. I know somebody said 4, but yeah, we have 8 corners right there. It's slightly different if you ask this question in Spanish, ¿Cuántas esquinas hay? Anybody who speaks Spanish is probably going to know what the answer to this. Esquina is essentially a word for corner. And the answer to this question is 4. There are only 4 esquinas allá, and they are those on the outside. If you ask a different question, ¿Cuántos rincones hay? Then you get a different answer. There are 4, and they're the interior corners. Because in fact, there are 2 different words for that concept in Spanish. And if you think about it, it's actually quite important. When somebody says something like, watch out for that table, don't hit your hip on the corner, you know exactly what corner they mean. It's kind of hard, and frankly, it'd be really impressive to hit your hip on the corner of a room. Like you'd have to get it right in there. It'd be really impressive. It's kind of like watching the little DVD bouncing logo, right? And you just keep watching, and it's like, God, it's going to hit that corner. It's going to hit that corner. Oh, it just barely missed it. It's like, yeah, that's an achievement. So anyway, that's just something that, like, if you don't know Spanish, you never would have thought of before if your language was English. Corners are corners. Well, it turns out they don't necessarily need to be so. Another one, this is just phonologically, we have these two words, spit and pit in English. They're actually different. And you can tell if you put your hand right up in front of your face and focus on the P and say spit, and now say pit. And if you'll notice for the second one, there is quite more of a burst of air because, in fact, the second one is aspirated. In English, though, we don't think of these P's as different. Like the P in spit is basically the same as the P in pit. And whatever. I mean, sound engineers know they're different when you have like a handheld mic in front of your face because it's really annoying. But otherwise, we think of them as basically the same. Whereas in other languages, they can be quite different. So these are two words of Hindi, tal and then tal. And they're completely different words. And you can see that they're even spelled differently, tal and tal. The first one means postpone, and then the second one, I guess, refers to some sort of a place where you can buy wood. I've gotten wood shop, lumber yard, lumber shop, something like that. I hope it's actually still a word of Hindi. If there isn't, somebody can, leave a nasty note in the comments. That's not a word we use anymore. It means something totally different. But anyway, it illustrates the basic idea that this aspiration, which is just a background note of how you properly speak English, is purely, is functional in a different language like Hindi and very, very important in order to make yourself understood. In fact, even this past Monday, I'm constantly learning new things. This was an example that somebody from the conlang community, William Annis, found and showed me. This is Amharic. And it's an absolutely fascinating little facet that I never would have even imagined is possible. These are two sentences the judge judged against Astor and then the judge judged in Astor's favor. They're basically opposites. And what's happening is the verb is at the end of the sentence, and I want you to look at these parts of it. Essentially, the verb is agreeing with the little preposition that means against somebody's favor or in favor of somebody, which is just wild. I mean, I've heard of applicatives, but usually that involves some sort of switch up of the arguments and changing structures and everything. This looks just like agreement with a really weird thing to agree with, and that's just awesome. Oh, it just gets me up in the morning. But anyway, so being a part of the conlanging community, this is what I gained. You gain essentially an understanding of the ways that languages can and do differ, and then once you have that, you get to a point where you realize basically, all right, languages can do pretty much anything. So then when you sit down to create a language, you really are saying, what is it that I want to do with this language? I have all of the options before me, and now what am I going to do with it? And so, for example, if you ask me, like right now, just a quick example, what the word for corner is in Dothraki, it's kemichuf. And there actually isn't a distinction between an interior and exterior corner, but not by accident. It's because I wanted it to be that way. And in fact, it has to do with the unique etymology of the word. It ultimately comes from a word kem, which means conjoined. And so what how the word came to be is that it's talking about the meeting of two walls or the meeting of two things. And so that's what it's focusing on, not the interactional properties of the human, but actually what it is and what it's doing. And so that's why there is only one word for corner in Dothraki. It was something I did on purpose, not by accident. So now that I'm kind of here, I just wanted to show you, I wanted to kind of give you an in-depth example of the type of questioning I do when it comes to translation and things that I work with. So this is a script page from the first season of Defiance, where this entire exchange is in the Erathian language, and we're going to focus on this first sentence, which is Okay, an elder Erathiant is saying it's how the Castes killed us in the Great Diaspora. Caves filled with chlorine gas. So I got that and I think, well, of course, I don't have a word for chlorine gas. So what am I going to do with that? How am I going to translate that? To catch you up to speed for those who are not familiar with Defiance, I'm going to need to introduce you to some aliens. First, there are the Erathians. They look like this. They kind of have orange hair like that. Their planet was previously, like before the show started, conquered by the Castethans. And basically, they were kind of, at some time in the distant past, it was kind of like the Norman conquest. They came, they took over, they became the rulers for a while. Now they're on more or less even footing, but there's still some tensions due to the history. And then a third set of aliens are the indigenes. The indigenes are responsible for pretty much all of the technology that the rest of the aliens, called collectively the Votans, enjoy. So they created all of the spaceships, all of the nanotechnology, everything. And they are themselves kind of an interesting creation. They kind of modify themselves genetically. They have implants all over the place. Their eyes can act like microscopes. Their hands can do really fantastic little machinations. So for example, with their language, their writing system is actually a post hoc creation. Every single glyph in the language, whether it's for a number or a syllable or whatever, has these little conjoined double hexagons. This is nothing that would ever arise in a natural context because it's way too complex to draw with your hand and get it right. But indigenes can do it exactly right every single time because of their augmentations. And so they actually created this writing system for themselves after the point in time where they started augmenting themselves. Anyway, so this is their number system. Their number system is base 7, and you'll kind of see why it's base 7 if you see how the number system works there. So yeah, you can see the little tick mark going as we go from, azu, kizu, fozu, dezu, nuzu, hazu, and then that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then ama, you switch the suffix and you get 7, all right? So basically, their 7 is the equivalent to our 10, like 1, 0, all right? So I started with them when I needed to come up with words for the elements, the periodic table of elements. I reasoned that they would be the ones to kind of codify and then really make use of this. And they actually invented a system for referring to the periodic elements. They did it by protons. So chlorine has 17 protons. 17 in base 7 is 23. What that means is that it's the digit 2 followed by the digit 3 equals 17 in base 7. All right, so then the word for 17, 23 in base 7, you have kima, which is basically 20. Remember, that's the number 2 with the ma suffix, and now you see the 2 lines and then also the straight line up and down in the middle. That's 20, and then 3, of course, we know, fozu, so 23 or 17 is kima fozu. They also have a suffix, vun. This was an older suffix. Basically, the word vun used to mean just something like stuff way back when. Now it's a suffix you can add to things to make a kind of nominal compound. And specifically, they add it to numbers to create a word that means that element. So when you add vun to 17, you get chlorine. Kimafozvun. Kimafozvun. Yes, sorry, I can say it right. And of course, you can spell it like that with the numbers in front, or you can spell it all the way out. It's basically the equivalent of this in English, spelling 12 like that. God, I love it. Oh, it stopped. All right. Anyway, so 12th. All right, so we've created this word now in indigene, or the indigene language, which is called Indogisnen. All right. Next step is to borrow that into Castithan. And the reason is that Castithan is essentially the language of commerce, politics, everything. It's the English of the Votan world, all right? So they borrowed all of their scientific terminology from indigene, or Indogisnen, all right? So that gets borrowed in, and it gets borrowed in pretty well. So it's Kimafozuvun in Indogisnen, and then in Castithan, it's Kimafozuvuno. You have to add the O suffix on there to make it functional, really. All right, so then you have this word in Castithan, and by the way, there's some quirks, little aside with the spelling, because Castithan spelling is kind of slightly more difficult than English, but slightly less difficult than Tibetan. Tibetan, I think, is the most difficult that we've created on the planet. So just some notes, like, for example, you can write ki this way or this way. The reason is that there are two different types of Ks in the history. So you have this older word which had a long vowel, liku, which is now pronounced ligo, and it refers to some sort of small animal. That's using essentially the traditional K, and you'll see that the traditional K is now pronounced G in certain circumstances. However, the old ejective K, which is here for the word niku, which is now pronounced niko, and it means kind of lot or parcel. That one is always pronounced K no matter where it is in the word. So when they do borrowings, they tend to use that special K just to make sure that everybody knows it's always pronounced K. Same thing kind of here with, these are both pronounced the same, but the one with the longer vowel, or that used to be the longer vowel, is always going to be pronounced ma, so we use that just to be safe. And same, the first Z also changes in certain circumstances, the second Z does not, so you use the second Z when spelling things out, so that gets us kima and zu. This one has a slightly different explanation. So these are the non-sibilant fricatives that have kind of a different story. F is pronounced F at the beginning of the word, and it tends to be pronounced V in the middle of the word. So for example, we have this word that used to be pronounced that way. It's pronounced fozwo, ritual. It's a nice F at the beginning of the word. In between, you have this older word, hifa, which is pronounced hivo. It's the word for shirt. It's pronounced like a V in the middle of the word. But since there are no other fantastic ways of representing the A, it's kind of known that you have to swap out for the sibilant fricative, since there's two versions of each one. There's two Z's and two S's. There aren't two F's. So you just use the regular F in a borrowed word, and you know that rather than being pronounced V, it's pronounced F because it's a borrowing. And the same is true of the original V, which is often pronounced H in between vowels. You know it's pronounced V because it's a borrowing. So that's how you get the spelling of kima wozuno in Castithan. So the reason we had to create it in Castithan is because a lot of the borrowings in Erathiant that have to do with technology come from Castithan, usually via Indojisnem, but Castithan is where they got a lot of terminology because of the time when Castithans were essentially in charge of everything. So that gets borrowed into Erathiant this way, and it's now kimafozvun. Notice that we lost a U there. That's because they're used to having to remove vowels in between sibilants and secondary consonants, moving from Castithan to Erathiant, because that just happens a lot with Castithan words. So they saw this one and said, well, there probably isn't a real U there. It was, even though there was a real U there, they thought there wasn't a real U there. It's the same kind of thing that happened with, what's a good example from English? Like nuncle. I think it was originally nuncle, but now we call it uncle because we thought people were saying an uncle as opposed to a nuncle. Really weird. Anyway, so it's that type of a thing. Now, as for the word itself, this is just another kind of a fun aside. Erathiant has a series of noun classes that are indicated by the initial consonant. And it just so happens that since this word begins with a K, it falls into the dangerous animal class. So Claidi is a dangerous insect. Gombisi is a kind of a tentacled beast that comes from above and sucks you up. And then Kangezi is Gangezi, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce my stuff. Gangezi is a word for like the alpha of a pack of animals. So for that reason, they treated this like this was the root, that the root was actually imafozvun, and that the K was incidental and indicative of a class 4 membership, which means that they created this word, rimafozvun, which means chlorine, the element or the substance, then kimafozvun, which is now the dangerous animal and has the concept of danger in it, is used specifically for chlorine gas, which is what the Castithans used to kill them back in the old days. And that is basically the story for translating just that word in that sentence, in that scene, in that episode in the show Defiance. So that's kind of the process I go through when I create words. And basically, it's all thanks to the education that I had coming up through the conlanging community. I know to ask questions that I never knew to ask before. And so one of the things that I realized when we had this great shift in the internet and how we interacted with it, I don't know if it was 2009, 2010, 2011, but it was that time where suddenly nobody was using hand-coded HTML anymore for their own personal websites. People kind of were going away from listservs bulletin boards even, and instead we're interacting through like, microblogging platforms, blogging platforms, social media platforms. I started to see a lot of conlangers coming to the art, especially with a lot of popular media like Avatar and Game of Thrones, who knew those shows but didn't know anything about the old conlanging community, and who definitely at this point in time were not going to join an email-based listserv where they communicate with people via email. It's like, that's not even a part of our vocabulary anymore. And so the thing was, though, I felt like the education that I had, which I thought was fantastic, was being lost and is essentially irrecoverable. Even though you can search all of the archives on the Conlang listserv, they're publicly available. There's great stuff there. Nobody's going to look at it. Nobody's going to pull it up. Nobody's going to go through and read old emails. It's not going to happen. And so that was one of the things I hope to do with this book, The Art of Language Invention. I'm kind of trying to rescue some of that knowledge and put it somewhere, oddly enough, into old media hardcover book form, because I think people that work, that are conlangers that are primarily on Twitter and Tumblr are actually more likely to get this book than they are to actually pull up the old archives of an email list or join it. Which is a really weird thing, a weird reality we live in, but it's kind of where we are. So that was kind of my fondest hope and purpose for this book, is to kind of capture that, put it somewhere so that other people could benefit by it. And so it's not even like my stuff, it's the stuff that I learned and basically just put into this capsule. So anyway, that's the story behind this book. Thank you guys so much for your time and listening, and if you get it, I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, hooray.
So, first of all, thank you for coming. There's this old chestnut about cellar door being the most beautiful phrase from a phonetic standpoint in English. Mm-hmm. Since the people who are hearing your languages aren't native speakers, how does the sound of the languages you create play into their creation?
Of course, that's always the thing. So that was Tolkien that said that the most beautiful word was cellar door. And of course, he didn't mean cellar door. He meant celado, which is how he would have pronounced it, right? So that was the thing that was supposed to be most beautiful to him. Was like, for us, cellar door, it just sounds, I don't know. And even so, of course, that thing is, it's entirely subjective. But you can tell, though, if somebody thought celado was really beautiful, you can see how that really informed Tolkien's languages. So when I'm creating languages, especially for shows, I know that the bulk of the audience is probably going to be English speakers. And because of that, I know that they have kind of the history of cultural stereotyping that exists for English speakers. That is, we have kind of a predictable range of which languages we think are going to be beautiful and which languages we think are going to be harsh. So you can play with those so that, if a producer wants a language that sounds like harsh or guttural, you know what that means and you can produce it. But it's not actually true that any language is beautiful or ugly. It's totally just basically cultural stereotyping and just random resemblances between the language you speak and the languages you think are beautiful. So yeah, it's an unfortunate byproduct of our existence, but I can still use it to my advantage if I have to.
Hi. You mentioned that you created your first language while you were studying at UC Berkeley, so I was wondering how much formal linguistics education you have and how that has helped or not helped your language creating.
Yeah, so I actually started creating my first language at the same time that I started studying linguistics, or I think I did. I told a very strange story in a lot of interviews that when I'm actually giving a talk later at UC Berkeley, and I went back to my old notes to photocopy some of them this is for the Linguistics Club, to show at that presentation. And going through my old notes, I actually discovered what I had been saying in interviews was factually incorrect. So I thought that I created my first language in the spring semester of 2000 when I was a freshman and when I was taking Arabic and Esperanto and Russian and Linguistics 5. It turns out I wasn't taking those classes at that time. I did take Arabic and Esperanto, but I took Russian and linguistics the next semester in the fall of 2000. So yeah, I took Russian and linguistics. I had previously taken a year of Arabic and a semester of Esperanto, and I started creating my first language at the exact same time that I was taking my very first introduction to linguistics, which I had never heard of before, and I only took because it was a breadth requirement. But I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks in. I actually have the date if I go back to my notes, but I forget. Anyway, so I kind of started growing as a language creator as I was learning linguistics. Oh, but I eventually did finish out with a linguistics major, and I also got my master's degree in linguistics at UC San Diego. Definitely the study did inform a lot of what I did, but at the same time, it was helpful to have the background of a language creator so that I could know to kind of interpret what I was learning in linguistics with more of an artistic and also critical eye, especially a lot of the theoretical stuff. Like theoretical syntax is not really informed what I'm doing at all. But a lot of what I studied in morphology, especially like lexical morphology, word and paradigm morphology, and a lot of what I studied in historical linguistics has informed what I do enormously, and definitely phonology too. And typology is huge. There was a lot of back and forth. But anyway, so yeah, a lot of it came in, and definitely linguistics was an important part of my education as a conlanger, but I would say equally important, if not more important, was my education as, from other language creators, yeah.
I was interested in birth of language. Have you investigated that?
Well, like language, qua language, like language at all?
Yeah, like 6,000 years ago.
Oh, well...
what shreds we know,
I think we do know some stuff about 6,000 years ago, but, essentially... as
like maybe that's how it directly translates to an object. Phonemes.
I don't really buy that. I don't think that the earliest forms of languages, they were necessarily such great sound symbolism like that. There's sound symbolism that exists throughout the world's languages. So often, if you have a vowel where your mouth is closed, like E, it's often associated with small things, and if your mouth is wide open, A, it's often associated with large things. But beyond that, there's not a lot that isn't language specific. So if you think about English, we have words like gleam, glint, glisten, glitter, glow. You could probably come up with others. There are others. And you'll notice those all kind of have something to do with shininess, right? But there's nothing, that's an English-specific thing only. It has nothing to do with any other language on the planet. There's nothing about glee. It means glee. No, there's nothing about gla that tells you, oh, this has to do with shininess. It's just a bizarre cultural, historical artifact of English. Now, having said that, of course, I study the history of languages a lot. I don't think that we're at the point, and I doubt we'll ever be at the point where we can say, oh, this was where language was created. This is how it came to be. I don't think we're ever going to get there. Honestly, we're pressing it when we go back to things like Proto-Indo-European. There's a lot we know, but then there's so much we don't. There are definitely people out there who have looked into doing this. Like Joseph Greenberg is a famous linguist and made some brilliant typological discoveries, was a big believer in proto-world, that you could actually find the commonalities between all the languages on the planet. I would say most linguists don't accept that. Wouldn't even accept like some of the less grandiose claims like there were 10 original language families, which I've also heard. I'd say most don't accept that. Most know that like the further back in history you go, like the less and less certain we can be about what we're saying about these languages. Though, but hey, from here on out, everything's going to be recorded. So that's nice.
Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. I'm curious, do you have any particular features of your languages or of languages in general that you feel like are really interesting, that you feel really enamored with? Like you mentioned in the example that you gave, you had noun classes, you had spelling variations, you had this very systematic writing system that reminds me of Hangul, for instance. Is there anything that you feel that you notice yourself saying, like, I can't put this in another language again because I do it all the time?
Yeah. Well, definitely, I mean, noun classes are one of my most favorite things. It's so easy to create words and to create really interesting words that you never would have thought of if you had noun classes. I love them to death. So, but yeah, I've only ever, like the one I did for Raytheon, that was like my second big one, and I haven't done that precisely again. But, oh man, yeah, I could just do that all day. Love noun classes. Noun case is another one I'm fond of, but that you can get away with. I mean, most languages have noun case in some form. But yeah, case systems are loads of fun. I think where I get into trouble is not something that I love, but something that's a weak point of me. I just hate verbs, and it's so easy. It's so easy to do a verb system that's basically perfect imperfect. Lots of languages either are that way or started out that way, where there's just basically a binary distinction of perfect and imperfect, so done and not done. And it's so easy to just do that and say, all right, we're done. But I kind of do it too much. I know I shouldn't. But verbs are just so complex. They change by the decade, precisely how they're used. I mean, just watch a football game, and the guy says, during the replay, it's like he'll say, if he doesn't pick up that block right there, he doesn't run to the end zone. That's all the present tense, but it's not actually the present tense. I mean, it's the present tense, but it's some sort of weird, bizarre, hypothetical, counterfactual tense. We just use the present tense for it in a sports context only, right? That happens. That's real verbs right there, and it just pisses me straight off. God. That's why it's the worst part of learning any language. I don't care how simple a language will tell you. It's like, oh, you have these agreement patterns. We don't have that in Chinese. Yeah, I don't care. I'm not learning that verb system. It's incredibly complex. Just because the words themselves don't change doesn't mean the system isn't complex. It probably means it's more complex. Ugh. Verbs. All right.
I'm curious, what's your favorite word? What language is it in? What does it mean? And what was the context that you like it used in? Do you have a favorite word?
Favorite word that I created?
Yeah,
Or,
more likely.
Okay.
Well, you could tell us both the ones you like that others created, but I'm kind of curious about yours.
I don't know. I actually, it's funny. I get this question a lot, and I never have a very good answer. And I'll tell you why. The words that I remember the most are the ones that I use the most, and they tend to be very prosaic words, like the word for need to in Dothraki, zigarelat. I know that one, but it's there's nothing very great about it. I just use it all the time. And actually, I was just talking about this. There's a particular reason I think that I don't remember a lot of the really fancy, interesting words. I'll give you an example of one that I know because I used it recently, but nhaj is the word for sticky in Dothraki, and nhajov is a word for a situation that is more trouble than it's worth, and so you'd likely want to avoid it. And I thought that was a pretty good word, but I've never used it. And the reason is that, especially for these shows, the words, I'm acting as a translator. I get English scripts and then have to translate what's given to me. And so the words that I end up using are the words that the writers come up with, and they don't think of these really fantastic and interesting words that exist in these languages, where perhaps if there were native speakers, they would find uses for them. They would have different patterns of use. But instead we're working with English patterns of usage and words that the English speakers come up with. And so consequently, since my most common interaction with my own languages is when I translate, those words are the ones I know the most. So there are scores of words that I have completely forgotten about, and I usually only run across them when I'm looking for some word in my dictionary and it happens to be right next to another word that's really cool. I'm like, oh my God, I forgot I created that word. It's so cool. Now, here's the word for belt, and and I go on from there. I do have a least favorite word in English, crafts. That's the most hideous word I've ever heard. Just awful.
Do you have a word aversion for that? Like
It's,
moist?
first of all, crafts. It's FTS right in a row. That's barbaric. And it's just, makes me think of the term arts and crafts. Which just weirds me out. I don't know. All right. There was who has the mic? Oh, over there. All right.
You'd mentioned complexity in one of the previous questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are there, in the conlang community, are there any measures of complexity or precision or granularity for different languages?
Yes, but they're not applied to artistic languages usually. That is, language is created for the purpose of art. Usually where you see things like that discussed are a creation of auxiliary languages. So languages like Esperanto that are built either for international communication or communication within a group. They try to measure things much more objectively so that I can say, which one is better. We tend not to do that in the artistic language community for the same reason that you don't typically go to paintings and say which one is better and then come up with objective reasons for why one painting is better than another. There are certain measures that exist within linguistics, such as the minimum word dependency. I'm going to get this wrong. Minimal length dependency, I think it is. There's a paper that just came out of this, just came out of MIT on this, where if you subscribe to the theory of morphemes, which I don't, but if you do, you can chop up a word and see how many of them there are and come up with a number that tells you something or other. But I haven't used it myself, and I don't think it enjoys a lot of use within the artistic language community, but definitely within the Auxlang and perhaps Engelang community. Engelang being engineered languages that don't necessarily need to be natural.
As somebody who studied a lot of languages and studied a lot of linguistics, I'm sure you're aware that there are some languages that are, although they have their own vocabulary, but structurally and in terms of lexemes, they're very close to English. You basically can do a word-for-word translation and maybe change the word order a little bit. And there are other languages where, in that culture, in that language, you just express an idea structurally completely differently. You can't really say in translating one sentence to another that this word corresponds to this and that to that. Mm-hmm. When you do these constructed languages for TV and movies that you're going to be translating English scripts, does that tend to make you create languages that are structurally closer to English so your translation job will be easier?
No, not a bit. No. Not at all. But of course, just a comment, the languages that are going to be closer to English structurally are going to be those that are related to English, yes. Genetically, so like the Germanic languages. But even so, there's a general tenet that we pretty much believe to be true, that you could translate anything into anything when it comes to languages spoken.
I'm not saying that that's not true.
But like the word for word, yeah.
Yeah, what you're going to be doing, and to make it easier for yourself.
Yeah, no, not at all. No, because that would be boring. Because the reason I do this is I love creating languages. That's my fun. I mean, the closest thing I've gotten to English is actually is Old Trigetis slang in the 100, but that's because it's actually supposed to be an evolved form of English 100 years later. So it's really, but there it's supposed to be like English because it's kind of supposed to be English, right? But other than that, no. Honestly, the languages couldn't be more different. And they range from marginally somewhat kind of close to totally unrecognizably out there. But yeah, that's how I have my fun.
So every year, we lose dozens, maybe hundreds of human languages to extinction, and we lose the cultural payload with them. How do you feel about the ethics of conlangs going into, people running around and geeking out on Klingon when we're losing real human languages that they could be learning? And why do you not consider using obscure human languages for some of these shows, bring them back a little bit, give them a new life, make people aware of them, rather than artificial languages?
Let me ask you this. How do you feel about people getting really, really excited about novels like The Hunger Games, which are stories about fake people, when we're losing the stories of real people every day that are dying?
Honestly, I think that's a sort of a false analogy. We have, and I've come from a very specific basis on this, but I guess I would say, how do you feel about ISIS destroying antiquities when you can make new stuff?
I'm sorry, say the
How
last
do you
part?
feel about ISIS destroying antiquities when you can make new stuff? That's equivalent to yours. Is it? And I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong.
You're
but
saying that I'm destroying natural
No.
languages in order to produce these?
I'm not saying you're destroying natural languages. I'm saying, could we not use some of the energies that people go into learning con languages, geeking out about con languages, going to Klingon conventions? I'll tell you, I get very annoyed when I saw even here at Google recently, people talking about looking for Klingon resources to do something in Klingon, and it's like, great, but let's put that effort to saving a real language. Because when we lose those languages, when the last speaker dies, it's never coming back as a living language.
Yeah, so of course, and in fact, if they weren't going to be doing Klingon, they would be doing the other thing, right?
Well, that's
No,
a good answer.
of course
but
not.
You
No,
could,
so let's
you
stop.
could use real human languages for some of these
You
concepts.
certainly could, yeah. We could have found for example, we could have found some very rarely spoken language and given it to the barbaric Dothraki who are ripping people's tongues out. How would that have been?
Wasn't necessarily saying it was not.
Okay. But that's actually the issue that comes up. For example, there are a lot of languages that are dying out right now. Not the majority of them, but certainly a minority of them, that are dying because the speakers don't want other people to use their language. They don't want people to write it down. They don't want foreigners speaking them. Do we respect that? Or do we just kind of sigh and let the language die out and respect the wishes of these people who don't want contact with the outside world? It's a different kind of ethical question. But personally, there are two ways of looking at it. One, artistically, if you're talking about a totally fictional reality, it breaks the reality to use a language that actually is spoken by other people on Earth. It's kind of an odd thing. I always find it odd when people are speaking English when they oughtn't be, like Amadeus. I mean, it was a fantastic movie. It was a fantastic movie, but honestly, why were they speaking English? Especially I don't know. Well, it's actually kind of a bizarre thing of movies that we think that British English would have been better than American English. I mean, it wouldn't. It's the same thing. But I don't know. So artistically, it simply breaks it. And honestly, there's no alternative here. The alternative to using creative language in Defiance was English. They were never, ever going to consider using any other natural language, or the expense involved in finding somebody to translate into those languages. And then furthermore, if you think about especially some very some minority languages that aren't spoken very well by very many people, and you start to translate some of the dialogue in Defiance. For example, this sentence that I showed you about the chlorine gas, odds are that Piraha doesn't have a word for chlorine. So then it's a question of what you do. It seems doubtful that you could get a speaker up there who would have to learn and understand English well enough and perform on a deadline to be able to translate into it. So you need somebody else. And undoubtedly, they would have to create words. They would have to create words either by working with native roots or have a whole load of English borrowings in there, or worse, create words that kind of look like the real language and use them in those scripts, which to me seems really offensive. Essentially, you're creating words to plunk down into somebody's actually existing language. You're not a part of the culture, and you're saying, well, we're going to represent this as a word in your language for the purposes of this television show. I just can't see that being a good idea. On a separate note, if you just kind of remove the created language aspect entirely, the fact, of course, that there are dying languages is terrible. It's a question of what one can do as an outsider in order to either prevent it or to preserve those languages. I'm not sure how a lot of speakers of minority languages would feel if there were, say, a bunch of teenagers from Southern California who started to learn their language just because they thought it was cool and funky and it was used as kind of for these quirky people in this show. That, at least for me, that would make me feel a little uncomfortable. So I think that the sentiment is well-founded. I don't think that the solution you presented is a good one, or feasible, or necessarily respectful. I also think that for standard preservation of languages, There are people that are trained to do that. It's not an easy thing. And of course, I know them, and in fact, I've studied under them coming through linguistics. It's not just something that anybody can do. It takes a lot of work with the culture. And having worked with Hollywood a bunch, it's a lot of work that I know that nobody would be interested in doing. They wouldn't be interested in paying for it. They wouldn't be interested in taking the time with it because they have deadlines and they're doing what they're going to do. I'm not sure if that answered every single aspect of your question, but if not, I'm happy to talk about it further because this is an issue that comes up every single time created languages are discussed. So, thanks.